So, welcome back, not to Third Age Reforged, but to Silmarillion Total War. This, I think, is going to be the first time that I show Silmarillion Total War on my channel. It should be the first video that gets published, although it might not be. There might be another one that comes in before this one, but regardless, this is going to be one of the first two that I do show. So as a result, there is going to be quite a long preamble before we actually get into the battle itself, because we're going to be going through each of the army compositions here in a little bit more detail, because of course this is all entirely new, and there are a few things that I need to talk about as I go through the army compositions themselves, just to sort of let you know some of the ways in which Silmarillion is significantly different to Reforged. There are of course a lot of more subtle differences as well, which I'm not going to go into too much detail on the subtle differences, because obviously that comes down to just how the different units are conceptualized, such as, you know, the archers having a couple of differences, like I think a little bit more ammunition and a little bit more range just in general for the archers when compared to Reforged, but that obviously depends on the individual units, and there's no sense in going into that much exhaustive detail just for a little battle like this. That will have to wait until faction overviews in the further future, when Silmarillion Total War is a little bit closer to the finished article. Of course, this is still an alpha, as it is at the moment. This is a map that you should be fairly familiar with, though, because this is going to be the Winter Hamlet, which is a map that I think is about a year old at this point. It was used to sort of demonstrate the very first sort of, not alphas as such, but the first demos of 0.97 for Reforged, because I do remember playing on this one last Christmas. So obviously the wintry setting is back once again, as is my sore throat. But regardless, we'll get into having a look at the army compositions, and then we'll have a look and see how Silmarillion interacts with these maps. See how it's different. And this one was sent to me by one of the mods, well, one of the primary driving forces behind this mod, and that is of course J-Monster. And he is going to be playing as one of the two Realm of Angband factions. Now I should say that I'm not as familiar with the lore of this particular part of the Lord of the Rings history, Tolkien's universe. But yeah, we can always work around that. So we have some wretches of Angband here at the front, which of course you can tell from their numbers, their name, and just the general look of them that they are the lowest tier of units that the Realm of Angband has available to them. Very much akin to something like the Orc Fodder, you would imagine. Obviously they're hiding here in the trees. But yeah, looking through each of these units is obviously going to be one of the things that we very much do. And it'll be interesting to see, actually, there are a couple of things I perhaps should mention before we get into the army compositions themselves, just so that we can have a look at them as and when we find them. The first thing, let's go and have a look over here at these. So we have a Orc Mangonel, which the artillery piece itself should be very familiar to those who have been familiar with Reforged in the past, because this is something that the Misty Mountains have available to them. But the significant thing behind this is going to be the crew. You can see them back here, and they look like regular infantry, and that's because they are. They are regular infantrymen, so the artillery crews in Silmarillion Total War are not just sort of wastes of space, essentially, when their artillery is gone. Much in the same way that the Troll Catapult crew always were, the crew themselves now have a bit of intrinsic value too. And this changes from faction to faction. So the Orcs, they have 100 artillery crewmen, so this not only makes it very difficult for you to actually kill the entire crew off with archers, but also they turn into a fairly numerous infantry unit when you're done with the ammunition from your artillery. So this gives them a little bit more utility, and hopefully we'll see a little bit more use out of units like this, because obviously in the past, when your artillery was out of ammunition, you just threw them in, and they would just be there to get in the way of sword blows for your more important units to survive. But now that's not necessarily the case, so it's good to see that the artillery crews are getting a little bit more attention here, and the Orc Mangonel crew essentially fills the role of standard Orc infantry when they're done with. But I think actually the fact that they're going to be more difficult to kill off with archers is going to be maybe even more significant. Another thing is the detachments system, which has been added in. Now I'm not sure whether we'll actually be able to see this in the Orc armies, because they're so tightly clustered together it's kind of difficult to see where one unit ends and where another unit begins. But essentially the purpose behind detachments is going to be that you can have a unit, but you can have it for half the cost but with half the men. So I imagine that this is going to be the sort of thing which you do more for, actually I don't know, I mean you could do it for cheaper units as well, to get a really cheap unit of say pikes but not for a huge amount of cost, or you could go for like a general's bodyguard unit, which you can make even smaller but make a little bit more affordable. So there's a lot that could potentially be done with this, and I'll be interested to see how that system develops as the mod also develops, when more factions and more units and the like are added, to see if anything's not powerful enough or anything's overpowered. But it's a very interesting system, and I think it does give a little bit more depth to army compositions, because obviously one thing that any Total War always suffers with eventually is that a meta does develop and samey army compositions can become a thing. But with the detachment system, I think that would be a little bit more difficult to do, actually. So it'll be interesting to see how that works. But yeah, those are the two main things that I'll say more generally. There is another thing that I'll say with regards to one particular unit as and when we get to it. You can see here we've got some iron-shod arbalists here, which of course they are crossbowmen, so the orcs, obviously, they fall back a little bit more on crossbowmen. They don't have very skilled archers of their own. In any of the Third Age submods, crossbows have always been one of the primary ways in which the orcs are able to deal damage at range, and that is certainly the case here in the First Age as well, it would seem, with the iron-shod arbalists. So the iron-shod obviously making up the spine of the Angband army. There's some iron-shod reavers in here as well, with some wicked-looking harpoon-like weaponry. It's hard. I mean, it is kind of like a sort of one-handed halberd sort of crossed with an axe, and they have a shield as well, so it's kind of an interesting one there too. They've got the same sort of, in a way, their style is quite reminiscent of Dol Guldur, with sort of like the tall helmets with like the tusks on the outside, and the sort of the long thin shields that they wear on their one arms. There's a lot of these iron-shod reavers that they've got on the front line here, so J-Monster obviously building a front line entirely out of them. Now this is the unit that I've got a little bit to say about. We have the Uruloki, which are sort of Hydra-looking things. I can only assume that they are genuinely a part of the Lord of the Rings lore, and people aren't going to be horrified at their inclusion, because I've never heard of these things before. But of course they are bestial units, so we've seen sort of units akin to this in the past. So, you know, elephant class units, or sort of really heavy cavalry in the shape of like the Drake Broodlings, even the trolls, you could say, being sort of more monstrous infantry. So the Uruloki from that perspective shouldn't be completely brand new, but they do have a fiery breath, which is, it kind of follows the same sort of principle as the axe throwers over in Third Age Reforged, where they have a really high base damage but not a very high armor piercing value, which means against heavily armored troops they won't actually deal that much damage with their fiery breath, but against lightly armored troops that are unshielded, they will be potentially very, very devastating. Of course, this gives the orcs something a little bit more scary in their ranks, because needless to say, when we get over to the forces of good over on the other side of the field, we're going to be seeing quite a lot of really nasty, high-quality units, which obviously stuff like these basic iron shods will really struggle against, but the orcs have their monsters, which they can use to good effect as well. So I'm really interested to see how the Uruloki actually perform in this particular battle, and obviously the orcs obviously have their artillery to back themselves up with as well. We've got some more iron-shod arbalists here on the flank, sort of pointing towards the woods in case of any cavalry flanking action, I would guess. And then we have the primary orc front line made up of, not iron-shod arbalists, let's get into the middle where the crossbows aren't in the way. We have a combination of the iron-shod halberdiers, so of course, once again, the orcs, they tend to forego pikes in favour of halberds just in general across any of the submods. It's not universal. Isengard obviously are a difference there, but I think Angband here, they definitely share quite a lot in common with Angmar in many ways. And then we have the Guardians of the Iron Crown as well, which look quite similar to the Blackwatch Legion, including the maces and the shields and the skulls. And actually, I think there is a unit that has like genuine severed heads on their model, but that doesn't seem to be the Guardians of the Iron Crown. But a very, very solid-looking front line this, which it will need to be, because I would imagine that, again, in terms of quality, Angband are going to be outgunned here. But it is worth saying that it is 2v3, so maybe Angband will not be so outgunned in terms of quality, and they can bring some of their scarier units. We've got some iron-shod ravagers here at the back, so they of course are the shock infantry with those sort of axes. Some of them look very makeshift indeed in typical orc fashion. Back over here we have the Vala. Oh god, hang on a minute. Valaaukar? Oof, I'm going to need to learn how to say that, because it's doubtless to say that these things are going to be pretty commonplace, I would imagine, when anyone's playing as Angband, because we have it's effectively a unit of Balrogs by the looks of things over here. Maybe lesser Balrogs would be a better description. A single Balrog, after all, could tear through an entire army all on their lonesome. But interesting to see how they perform. I would imagine that they're just trolls on steroids, so they're going to be able to charge into lines, do an awful lot of damage, but if you send them against the wrong kinds of units, they'll probably start to drop faster than you might expect, given their absolutely terrifying appearance. But we shall see. Very, very intimidating unit, to say the least. And then over on the other side we have some regular trolls. we have the Troll Guard of Gothmog, which share a lot in common with the Angmar Troll model from the Angmar Troll models from Reforged. They've got a new emblem on their front, however, as well. They also have these very nice looking shields, I have to say, which I like the fact that the shields are in the same style as the orcs, only bigger and sort of more bent out of shape. It looks very very thematic indeed. But very intimidating trolls as well, and I would imagine that they too are no slouches, maybe not up to the same level as their Balrog brethren over on the other flank, but still not the sort of things to be taken lightly at all. So like I said, this is obviously going to be a long first phase here that I'm going to spend to sort of go through the armies in a little bit more detail. I will say again that if that does not interest you, there is a timestamp in the description below. Do not come complaining to me when the preamble here is 20 to 25 minutes. There is a reason for that. If you don't like it, just skip it. It's not my problem if you sit through the whole thing and then complain at me. Then we have DT Titus, who's going to be another Angband player. So he too has got some Ironshot Arbalists. I'm going to go through this army a little bit quicker because I would imagine we're going to be seeing largely the same sort of thing over here. So a lot of crossbows, of course, which if they get into position and all of these really nasty, monstrous units also manage to start doing their thing, could be a problem for the forces of good here. We have some Guardians of the Iron Crown. They look like very nice heavy infantry, I must say. Very heavy shields, very heavy armour. A lot of Ironshod Reavers here, a lot of Ironshod Ravagers. So obviously the Ironshod making up the vast majority of these Angband armies, including the Halberdiers here at the back. A very dense formation indeed. 2 units of the Mangonel, which maybe is actually a little bit more feasible now, just because the crew themselves can act as makeshift infantry. Obviously it's not going to be match-winning performances from these 2 units at all, but the artillery itself can be useful, and then, you know, if it doesn't quite go your way, you're at least not in such a deep hole that you can't dig yourself out of it, considering that the crew themselves can then be used to patch holes in the lines. So 2 of them. Mangonel obviously very unpredictable, the Mangonel, as a force on the battlefield, so we'll see how well they can actually do. Actually, I think there is. Yes, there's some Bulldogs in here. The Bulldogs of Angband, and they're the ones with the severed heads on the back, so you can see that instead of skulls, they've got sort of fresh heads that they've managed to claim. So this is going to be a General's Bodyguard unit. It's possible that J-Monster has one as well, and I just missed it. But obviously some very intimidating sight to see the Bulldogs of Angband coming towards your lines. And that's going to be the General's unit, obviously. And then back here we have more of the Valarokar, or like lesser Balrogs. I think I'm going to refer to them as for the time being, just so that I don't sound like a complete idiot when I'm saying their name. And then more of the Uroloki. So I'm really interested to see how the Uroloki perform here, because I'm interested to see if they're fragile when they get into melee, or whether they're sort of a little bit more tanky, how powerful their fiery breath is. I don't think it'd be as devastating as the Witchers, just because if heavily armoured troops can survive it, that would suggest not, but still. Very, very interesting. But now, let's get on to the forces of good. Starting off with DT Ritchie, and he is going to be playing as the House of Feanor, and he has got a lot of cavalry hidden here in the trees, which is good to see. The House of Feanor are probably my favourite looking faction that I've seen in all of the preview material that has been posted up on the official Discord for Silmarillion Total War. I really like the red colour scheme and sort of the elven armour that they wear. We have some Riders of the Pass, which obviously you can see here. They have some bows, and I believe they pull out swords when they're in melee, so I think that makes them melee cavalry as well. I'm not entirely sure about that, because usually if they're a spear or lance cavalry, they wear the shield, they wear the spear or lance on their backs, so I'd imagine that will make them pull out swords when they get in close. But obviously, elven horse archers, we know what they're all about. They have shields as well, so honestly they might be able to outrange the Ironshot Arbalists here, which will allow them to try and pick apart the orcs from a distance. But they need to be a little bit careful, because I would imagine that they don't want to get too closely involved with a lot of the monstrous units that the orcs have available to them. This man is standing up on his horse because, you know, he wants to get the best view of the action as it happens. We have the mounted company of Karufin, and they have javelin cavalry, so it's going to be interesting to see how they perform. A lot of almost like a Linden-like aesthetic to this unit, only with a little bit more chainmail. I like it. I like it a lot. We'll see if the javelins can get in range to actually lay down their damage, because they need to be very careful, of course, of the crossbows. While there are a lot of sort of subtle differences between this and Reforged, there are certain things that will always remain constant in the Medieval 2 world, and that is you don't want to park your cavalry in front of a full unit of crossbows and just allow them to tee off into you. Riders of the Pass, though, should be able to outrange them, as I said before, and another unit of the mounted company of Karufin as well. Again, I don't know if I'm saying all of these correctly. It'll take me a little while to get used to all of these first age names. On the front line, we have some shield bearers of Hellavourn, so some of the human units, obviously, very, they kind of, in terms of style, they kind of look like a cross between Rohan and Rudar, which I'm a big fan of. I have to say, like, these units are probably some of my favourite looking that have been made. I really like the detail on these spears. I like the hexagonal shields. I like the designs on them. Very, very much in favour of them. As far as what they offer, they are of course a sort of quite a beefy human spear unit, and part of the thing that the House of Feanor are going to be well known for is, much like Dorwinion over in Reforged, they're going to have access to human and elven units which they can use to mix and match to fit the situation as they see fit. So that's going to be a nice spear-heavy front line there. Just in behind, we have some footmen of Amaras, which are elven line infantry. We know from experience, once again, while there are going to be differences between this and Reforged, elven line infantry are going to be the sort of the quintessential frontline pillar in a game like this, because their quality is going to be so difficult to break through efficiently. You're going to have to be a little bit more savvy when it comes to engaging a unit like this on the front line, I would hazard a guess. On either side of this, we also have some defenders of Aglon. I really like the look of this unit, I have to say. I really like the fact that they're wearing sort of like a chain coat, sort of a chainmail mask as well. I really like the detail on some of these, like, it's not even really a longsword, but that really does classify as a great sword, I think. But yeah, Defenders of Aglon looking absolutely fantastic. Elven Swordmaster units as well, so the Orcs are really going to have to be quite careful at how they choose to engage the defenders here. Over on this flank, we have some Stalkers of Thargellion, and this I think is sort of like a sort of basic javelin unit for the humans, so quite cheap. And I think actually this is a good, I think this is an example of a detachment unit from Secretariat. Secretariat's army actually starts mainly over there, but yeah, this is a detachment, I think, because this is the kind of unit that I think would have like 140-ish men in it, but it's got half of that 70, so he's paid half the money for a unit that effectively starts the battle at half strength. But for a unit of javelins like this, and this also would be a unit that I would imagine to be very, very cheap if you take a detachment of it. So we'll see how well that they can do in this battle, because we do have some more Stalkers of Thargellion over here. I can't imagine that they're only 70 per unit. Maybe they are, but I think this might be an example of the detachment system at work. We shall see. There's more cavalry back here as well, so going for a very cavalry-heavy army. This individual is going all over the damn place. Interesting glitch there. But we have a lot of cavalry from Richie. He's got some mounted company of Calagorm, so they look like lancers, of course, with nice big shields. Like a cross between Eldarenway Lancers and Knights of Numinas, so the very, very nice looking, I have to say. Like, there's a bit of hot pink on their shields, which maybe I'm not too sure about, but overall the armour looks terrific, and I would imagine they're absolutely devastating off the charge as well. Over here, we have the pride and joy of the House of Feanor's cavalry force, the Roqueni Magloro Knights, of course, and once again, they look like a cross between the Gwythi Roctor and the Knights of the Silver Swan. Very, very nice looking, I have to say, and once again, I imagine they are utterly devastating on the battlefield. I'm sure we'll get to see them in action here. And then some more mounted company of Calagorm. So once again, taking our time with these army compositions, really soaking in these new unit models that have been made. And I have to say, they've been made to look very, very nice. It's clear the amount of effort that have gone into these. Then we have a ballista from Secretariat, so we know what the ballista is all about. The ballista crew themselves, once again, more useful, sort of standard elven line infantry, but obviously lesser in number. It'll be interesting to see how well they can perform, because again, this does mean that you can't just send any old rubbish at an artillery crew and expect them to win, because elven line infantry will easily be able to beat fodder, whereas that wasn't necessarily the case before. A unit of fodder could probably overwhelm a unit of artillery crew quite easily. More mounted company of Calagorm, so once again a very nasty array of elven lance cavalry. Then just in behind we have more footmen of Amras, only these guys have had their armour upgraded, so they've traded in the red colour scheme for more of a purple, but also they've got a significantly heavier armour, more metal plates. Yeah, very, very nice indeed. So I'd imagine that they are going to be even more dominant on a frontline fight against some of the iron shots. More shield bearers of Halavorn. Again, I would imagine they're quite an efficient unit of spears, but I'm sure we'll see. There's not a great deal of Orc cavalry, to be fair, so their primary purpose is going to be holding the line, I think. More defenders of Aglon. I have to say, this is probably my favourite looking unit so far. I really like the chain and the swords that they wield. More defenders of Aglon. Over here, I did spy another rather interesting unit, a very strong unit of footmen, the Ottorn Maitimo? Ottorn Maitimo. Interesting name, but Elven Knight. This is actually something that Imladris do lack, a sword and shield unit that's like a general's bodyguard tier unit. But not something that the House of Feanor lack, apparently. And then back here we do have some archers as well. Some archers of Amrod, I should say. And obviously elven archers, we know what to expect from them. Dominant at range, and then also not half bad in melee either. And then the final army, actually no, not the final army just yet, we have another unit clad in red, the Roqueni Magloro from Secretariat. But then finally, the final army on the field today, played by Messier Corday, we have the elves of Osiriand. And again, I'm really sorry if I'm butchering some of these names, but a lot of them are quite new to me and I'm trying to do it off the cuff. We have some Lancers of Duluen, so a little bit more similar to the Sylvan Elven factions than the elves we've already seen from Feanor, who are a little bit more High Elven, but nonetheless, very, very strong Lancers I'm sure that we'll get to see in action today. Then we have some Mythern en Tol Gallen. That's a real mouthful, that. But again, Elven line infantry that actually carry maces. It's interesting to see an Elven unit that sort of has this style to carry a mace. So we'll see, obviously, AP, I would imagine. That should be useful against the Iron Shods, backed up by some spear host of Rathloriel. So some nice Elven spears on the front line to help hold things down. A very nice looking front line indeed. Some more Lancers of Dulwen. I'm sure I'll get used to some of these. Some Erfen en Tower. So in terms of looks, they certainly bear a lot in common with something like the Wardens of Amon Lank. Axes in melee, very good at range, I'm sure, as well. Back over here, some more spear host. And then our old buddies, we have the Ents. We actually have a General's Bodyguard over here. He looks like our Pharazon at the moment, and that's because the General's models still haven't been changed for some of these. But obviously the Ents are pretty much going to be the same sort of thing as we've seen in Third Age Reforged, I'm sure. But without further ado, let's begin. So the first that I'm going to be seeing at the very least of Silmarillion Total War in action. And also it is worth saying as well that a lot of hidden units that have just popped into being here. The Hunters of Rathloriel, Scouts of Galleon as well. So obviously the Sylvan Elves are a little bit more involved with the units that can hide. It is worth saying as well that J-Monster did advise me to go on to the Shader version 2, which I personally think is a horrible idea, because I've had really, really terrible luck with game stability, but this is the first time I'm doing Silmarillion, so maybe Silmarillion is a little bit more stable. We shall see. If it crashes, I'm going right back to version 1 and using my tried and true settings. But regardless, we can see here the House of Feanor spreading their cavalry through the woods, and obviously with Richie's army he's going to need to make good use of his cavalry here to really be as effective as he wants, because as strong as some of his footman units are, I think they will be more likely to be overwhelmed by the Orc forces that are across the way. And of course, it is worth saying as well that the red team here have to be the aggressors, I would imagine, 3v2. And there are a lot of mangonels pointing their way, which may be a little bit worrying for them. While pushing into the woods, the Lancers of Dwylwen are going to be just sort of covering the Green Elves as they move forward. I think that's the other name for the Elves of Osiriand. But the Lancers need to be careful as well, because they can't afford to just charge in, and also it is a pretty nice defensive position that J-Monster has struck up here. There's a few terrain features that he can use to good effect, so to get some units up on these little hillocks, and also spray down the mangonel fire as the elves approach. But of course the one problem that the orcs will really have here, I would imagine, is the fact that the elves are going to have an enormous advantage in terms of ranged. So yeah, guess what? The game crashed. Never ever again for version 2 shaders. I knew it was a bad idea, not with reshade as well. It's never going to work out. So, back to my tried and true settings, which have been absolutely fine on Reforged for the last couple of weeks, so it should be fine this for Silmarillion as well. So, yeah, Mounted Company of Kelagorm are going to be moving through the settlements itself. It is actually interesting here how the orcs are deciding maybe not to push into at least this side of the settlement to try and use some of the walls to maybe break up the good team's advance, because some of this offers a little bit more cover perhaps against the elven archers, because eventually the orcs are going to have to just accept the fact that they're going to be outranged by the elven arrows, and they're going to have to just sort of take it on the chin. But maybe if they can draw the elves in close enough, maybe into the settlement, and then maybe rapidly counter-attack into them, maybe that is the future that the orcs envisage for themselves here. But Richie is definitely spreading out with his cavalry on both flanks, so putting some pressure here on Titus as he moves his army. Of course, the danger here for Titus is that he won't be able to get set up quickly enough. He needs to get his Orc Mangonels pointing in the right direction before the elves are bearing down on him, because he definitely needs them to do quite a bit of heavy lifting here, I would imagine, if he is to have a great deal of success. Here we can see the Lesser Balrogs are sort of hovering with intent as the Mounted Company move forward. Definitely don't want to be charged by cavalry though. As we've seen in the past, a cavalry charge can lay low some pretty mighty foes indeed. And here come the mounted company, and then I mean, there's one of them just sort of charging off into the ether over here. I'm not really sure what he's hoping to accomplish by doing this. Are we going to see the first casualties of a Silmarillion Total War multiplayer game? I think we might be, as the mounted company of Caligorm are just going to charge headlong here into this big blob of iron shods. A nasty charge indeed, getting deep into that. Ooh, a lot of casualties there, causing a bit of a frame drop, but the lesser Balrogs also coming in, actually getting a couple of the charge actually connecting with them to a certain extent, as well as a couple of them do fall. However, the mounted company of Caligorm bit off a little bit more than they can chew there, because they charged directly into a group of orcs which did include spears, and also the close proximity of this bestial infantry meant that they were broken off there fairly quickly. But you can see how big the orc army is here, because it extends all the way over to here, and there's still a couple of elven units also putting some pressure on over here. A couple of casualties for the Angband player here. But yeah, Angband need to get themselves set up into a defensive position and dig in quickly here. Otherwise they're going to continue to give openings for the House of Feanor's cavalry to continue to do their thing, which is absolutely the last thing they want to happen to them. The Javelin cavalry is also over here. What was that? Ah. So that was the fiery breath. It has a sort of a cannon sound effect for the time being, although I'm sure that that will be amended at some point. Just a placeholder after all. This is a very early alpha version of the game. The mounted company of Corufin charging in there. Getting some decent damage done to the Ironshod Arbalest as well. The Ironshod Arbalest left out here all on their lonesome without any sort of cover, and this is a problem. I think Angband, they've tried to get back into a more defensive position, but they've left enormous gaps for the House of Feanor's cavalry to simply go ahead and have their way with a lot of these orc units, and already Titus finds himself in all sorts of problems really. Because the one thing that you can say about Richie's army is if you deny him the effectiveness of his cavalry, he would have been in a little bit more trouble. As it is though, he's already managed to get some pretty good value off with his cavalry. And Angband definitely needs to get themselves into a better position than this. The Shield Bearers of Halavorn now charging in, maybe a little bit too far ahead of the rest of their army though. I can't imagine they're going to perform too well in melee against these Balrogs. Oof. Well, that was the shots from the Mangonels. The Mangonels actually getting a very nice shot there into the centre of this Feanor army. In fact, I think it's about time we went down to half speed to get a real close look at what's happening here. These Shield Bearers of Halavorn already broken and fighting to the death, so they were sent ahead too far of the rest of their army. They needed to be kept closer to their elven support, and of course as spearmen they're not going to be able to deal quite the same levels of damage as some of the elven men that they're fighting, well, the elven brethren that they're fighting alongside. More Shield Bearers charging in. Won't be too much of a problem against units like Ironshod Ravagers, I would imagine, but still, these Ironshod Ravagers are still axemen, so the AP is going to be coming into effect here against these men. The Guardians of the Iron Crown also ambling forwards. These Ironshod Reavers too, though, I mean, the Realm of Angband have also overextended themselves just a little bit, getting into some of these elven footmen, and the footmen of Amras are going to be able to rip these Ironshod Reavers limb from limb. The Guardians are arriving on scene now. The Stalkers of Thargelion are going to be able to give some javelin support. The Mounted Company of Caligorm not really able to get the best of charges off there. They're charging more into their own men, to be honest with you, which at the very least doesn't cause friendly fire, otherwise it would be a real problem. If you can see here, this is probably the downside of Defenders of Aglon here. Very nice heavy elven swordsmen. They're just being overwhelmed here by the sheer number of orcs that they're having to face off against. Real problem for them. But we can also see over on this side the Defenders of Aglon. Well, I mean, still they're struggling a little bit in terms of sheer numbers. Some Mounted Company of Corufin trying to get in and around the sides. The Uraloki are over here though, blocking the way. The Orc Mangonel is actually on fire. As you can see there, the Secretariat's Ballista coming over and actually managing to thread the needle over these hills here to set one of them on fire, and the other is also being charged into by more Mounted Company of Caligorm, pulling out their sabres in melee now to try and deal with the Orc infantry. But this is the good thing about having a unit that's so big for an artillery crew. If you don't get a really nice charge off, it's going to take several bites of the cherry before you're actually able to fully finish them off, albeit one of the Orc Mangonel crews is trying to get away from here. Rise of the Pass are firing in. You can see the downside of Richie's army is being so cavalry heavy. He really needs to get around to the side more effectively and start charging into the soft, vulnerable underbelly of the Orc army here, because from the front his units are being utterly overwhelmed by the sheer number of Orcs, because he went so heavily into cavalry that his infantry force wasn't very big at all. And this, of course, has the downside of, as high quality as elven units do tend to be, when they're fighting against odds like this, it can be a real problem. Spear Guard of the Iron Crown here, charging through the gap, so another high quality unit of spears there, managing to get through the gap that the Shield Bearers of Halavorn have left aside behind. Lower morale than the elves, I would imagine, on these men, and it really does show. They've been crippled really already by the Orc infantry, and the elves need to make something happen with their cavalry here. However, over on the other side, we can see the other Angband army is starting to get pressurised a little bit more here by the elves of Osirian. The scouts of Gellion are starting to fire. Some of these arrows are hitting the snowy bank just in front of them, but several of them are finding their marks into the Orc army. But the Orc army is here in mostly loose formation, as high accuracy as the Elven archers tend to have. The Orcs should be able to absorb quite a lot of these casualties, and the Orcs don't really have too much of a choice other than to sit here and take it for the time being, purely because if they do charge forward to try and close down these elves, that's exactly what the elves want, and also it will leave some gaps as well for the rest of Secretariat's army to come forward and start doing its thing as well. Meanwhile, over here, we do have an Orc Mangonel crew still trying to get away, but I don't think that's going to happen. There's more mounted company here, which are about to get a charge off into them, pulling their swords out. In come the Javelins as well, the mounted company, trying to make something happen here with them. The Riders of the Pass continuing to fire. Some Stalkers of Thargelion. Some Valor... That's a real mouthful. Some of these words are very difficult to pronounce. It's going to take me a little while to get used to all of this. Defenders of Aglon here. You can see that they do... It's sort of like the green smoke from the Witcher fire, but it's nowhere near as devastating. I'm sure people are very glad to know. But the Uroloki continuing to loiter around here. And the real problem for the elves here is they're just being surrounded and outnumbered here. And now, with big monsters like this on the way, the lives of these elves are not going to get any easier. But you have to say, the elves on the front line are actually starting to turn the tide now. The cavalry is starting to find some good charges into the rear lines of the realm of Angband, and this is allowing the elves on the front line, like the elves here, they were outnumbered and outgunned, but they were able to hold the line long enough for that House of Feanor cavalry to get in behind the lines and start charging the orcs from behind. And now, all of a sudden, the tide does appear to be turning. These elven knights ploughing through the lines, looking absolutely splendid as they do so. They need to be a little bit careful though, because they are sort of ploughing into the section of line that does have some iron-shod halberdiers nearby. Doesn't matter how strong you are as a cavalry, you don't want to be charging unthinkingly into halberds. Meanwhile, Mounted Company of Calagorn back here, overextended here a little bit. The Guardians of the Iron Crown maybe getting a little bit greedy in how far they went into the elven lines, and now the Mounted Company are going to be able to charge them down. Guardians of the Iron Crown there. More javelins flying through the air, the Stalkers of Thargelion. And we'll get some decent volleys here. Not the ideal angle for them, but they're still going to be able to connect with a lot of these orcs. And the main problem for the orcs here is, of course, the devastation that the elven cavalry is able to lay down here. The back lines were exposed, and from that moment on, it was only going to be a matter of time before the orcs really started to struggle. I could see that Titus was trying to put his halberds behind to try and block this cavalry from charging in. But the problem was, if he didn't commit his halberds to the front, the elves probably would have been able to mulch their way through all of the orcs that were fighting there. The Bulldogs are on the front line. The balance of forces is fairly even actually here between the footmen in numbers and then the low quality orc infantry, but they're being backed up here in the middle by the Bulldogs, who are sitting in the middle of that line and being very scary indeed. The Roqueni are also over here. I just heard the Uroloki try and grill some men, but they actually succeeded more in grilling orcs than they did any of the elves, which is a problem for them. But the defenders of Aglon are now broken and fighting to the death. But that's a lot of friendly fire from the Uroloki as they continue to fight on the front line. The House of Feanor back over here. You can see more charges from the Riders of the Pass, this time trying to finish off this Mangonel once and for all. I mean, at the very least, the Mangonel isn't able to fire while it's under this sort of pressure. Difficult to get a good charge off on this sort of terrain as well. But they're not firing, which is all they needed. Meanwhile now, you can see the Scouts of Gellion starting to push forward. Looks like J-Monster is now going to come under the same sort of pressure that his ally is under, albeit he's in a better position, I think, because he's not having to deal with cavalry in the back lines. It's a little bit difficult as well to circumvent his army. He's sort of using the lake and the farms over here to make a sort of natural choke point, albeit a very wide one. But it is going to make it a little bit more difficult, at the very least, for the cavalry of the forces of good here to try and get in behind his lines. And it looks as though we might be seeing the first phases of the battle over here. The Wretches of Angband, I can't imagine they're going to do too well against units like upgraded Footmen of Amras, nor against the offerings from the elves of Assyriand either. There's a lot of Ironshod Reavers moving in as well. We'll just take a quick look over here on this side of the battlefield, because things are not looking good for Angband over here. It's hard to keep track of ranged units like this over the course of an entire battle, but it doesn't feel as though the Ironshod Arbalists have really had the kind of impact that crossbows can potentially have. And that's a real problem. You can see here there is a huge cluster, however, of Orc units that were largely victorious over here. And this is a problem. I mean, if Ritchie's infantry is not able to continue to hold on as valiantly as they have, the Orcs are going to be able to turtle up against this cavalry, and all of a sudden, things may be looking a little bit less rosy for the elves. The devastating charges they were having before, they weren't able to kill enough of the Orcs, which goes to show how numerous they really were. Mounted Company of Carufin able to charge in there, pulling out their blades, but the problem is a lot of spears and a lot of halberds over here, and the line infantry that is here was covered by them and is very heavily armoured and difficult to kill off as well. Ballistae coming in here trying to hit the Uraloki and the Balrogs. But I think here Ritchie is probably going to have to back off a little bit, because Secretariat went over to support the elves of Assyriand against J-Monster. So it's going to be interesting to see how this battle develops as we move into the later stages. Meanwhile, over here, you can see that the Orcs have set up a very nice looking front line as well. Halberds, heavily armoured Orc infantry as well. Footmen of Amras are going to be charging in. I mean, there's a big quality discrepancy here. You can just tell from the fact that, just from the way that the elves look. A nice charge in there. But the Halberds, with their phalanx, will be a very good anchor to this Orc front line as Secretariat moves in. You can see there the Uraloki continuing to rain fire down upon the elves, and the elves of Assyriand over here certainly not as heavily armoured as their brethren from the House of Feanor, and the Uraloki here able to just grill their way through sections of the line, still not as devastating as the Witchers, and a lot of them will get back up after being knocked over, but it is still going to be a bit of a problem here for the elves of Assyriand as they move forward. Definitely J-Monster has seized the initiative here, broken up the front line of these wood elves, and has now moved in with several units. You can see the Lances of Dwylwen moved in. The lesser Balrogs are in here. That's just the name I'm giving them for the time being until I learn how to spell their name say their name properly. A lot of these elven arrows finding their marks. The Earthen End Tower firing away as well. Here come the Troll Guard of Gothmog alongside the Balrogs, and the Lances of Dwylwen having to pull away. You can see here it's a real battle of the Titans, but normally, in Third Age Reforged, I'd say the Ents were the kings of this kind of warfare, even against stuff like the Olag Kai, but I'm not so sure against a unit that looks as scary as this one does, as they move in here to take on the Ents. Ironshod Ravagers starting to rout off, however. This is going to be the problem that the Orcs are going to face against such concerted pressure from the Elves, especially only against basic Ironshod units like this. The Elves, you would imagine, are going to be just fine dealing with this sort of pressure. The Orc Mangonel is still back here. Another problem that J-Monster is going to have, I would imagine, is going to come against the House of Feanor. I think his front line over here, though, is constructed significantly more solidly. You know, the Guardians of the Iron Crown look like a very solid infantry unit indeed that's hard to kill, backed up by the phalanx of the Ironshod Halberdiers. I think they're going to be just fine, you know. Footmen of Amras, upgraded or no. There are some Shield Bearers of Halavorn moving in here as well, but as we've already seen, you know, they're a very basic unit of spears, it would seem, and you know, with the lack of Orc cavalry on the field, that does take away a little bit of their utility, and they're just having to be here to sort of make up the numbers on the front line. The Ironshod Arbalists firing away. They're going to need the Ironshod Arbalists to do quite a lot of heavy lifting, I think, as the Elves start to advance, because I would imagine that one by one these Orc defences are going to be peeled away by the sheer quality of the Elven forces, and of course the fact they're being battered by the Elven arrows. The Roqueni managing to get another decent charge there into the Ironshod Reavers. There's a lot of crispy bodies, both Elven and Orc, nearby, as the Uraloki now charging into the rear of this position. I wonder what sort of unit they are. I wonder if they classify as elephants. That would be interesting to see, because if they do, that means they are subject to anti-cavalry damage, but that also means they probably have massive mass and are able to break through stakes, unlike regular cavalry. Wretches of Angband over here. As the Scouts of Gellion push forward, more Scouts of Gellion. Still, these lesser Balrogs over here fighting hard on the front line, but now they're going to be engaged by some Earthen End Tower, pulling out those axes, which this is the sort of unit which I would imagine to be quite good against trolls, and I would imagine that transfers to being good against these guys as well. Ironshod Ravagers that did manage to regroup and are now marching with the Ironshod Ravagers, the Troll Guard of Gothmog, actually pushing away the Lancers of Dweilwen, who have not really had the kind of impact I imagine that the Elves of Syrian player was hoping for. But if he can get them in behind the line, much like Richie did, maybe some good charges will be forthcoming. Over here, meanwhile, I think Richie's cavalry-heavy army hasn't really paid off in the end. I don't think he was able to really get the devastating work done that he wanted to. It looked like he was going to for a second there, but ultimately his infantry line was too... What on earth is going on over here? Well, well, well. That's a very disturbing sight, isn't it? But like I said, I think his infantry, while it was able to hold on for longer than I honestly expected it to, I think in the end he was too undermanned on the front line, and that is ultimately what's cost him here. Still, this is an alpha version of the game, so this is much more about just the spectacle of the battle as it unfolds, more so than any genuine balance talk for the time being, I'm sure. I say balance talk, balance looks actually pretty good from what I can see, but sort of in terms of how the players are choosing to approach these battles, I'm not going to be too critical of people because I haven't played this game at all, so I don't really know how it's going to interact with one another. But here you can see Mounted Company of Karufin getting a decent charge here into the back of the Ironshod Halberdiers, but they do manage to turn around, get some good damage done, and then they'll be able to turn right back around and deal with that as well. But Secretariat has sent a lot of his infantry around here to flank, and this is able to break this section of line. So the Shield Bearers of Halavorn holding on long enough for the Elves to get in behind the Defenders of Aglon to start tearing through them with those Elven Greatswords. And then also we have the Otorn over here as well, starting to chew through the Mangonel crew. There's a lot of Elven cavalry as well. Riders of the Pass charging around all over the place. The Elven Knights crushing their way through here, the Ironshod Reavers. So a bit of chaos is erupting here, which I often say favours the Orcs, but in this case I don't think it does, because I think they are outnumbered at this point on this particular engagement. Two Elven armies, or primarily Elven armies, that this Angband army that J-Monster is in command of has had to deal with, and I think he's actually done a very nice job of doing a lot of damage, but I think he is going to have to just settle here for doing a lot of damage, and little else, to be honest with you. I think his Balrogs have fallen by the wayside. I'm not sure where his Troll Guard have gone. I think maybe they all died at some point as well, maybe to a cavalry charge, which would be a real disaster. But the Ents are in here now, and you can see that the Angband army is really starting to fall apart at the seams. Just having a look on the front line. The Maithian using those maces to good effect, cracking through the crude Orc plate. Still, there's a lot of arrows just flying around all over the place. The scouts, the Randirim and Tol Gallen, are they the Rangers, I wonder? Possibly. I do know for a fact that there is only one Ranger unit in the game. By Ranger unit, I mean, of course, the body-piercing arrows. There may well be units that are called Rangers, but they don't have the effect of having their arrows pierce through multiple unit models. Only one of those exists, and I believe the Elves of Syrian claim ownership over that. Meanwhile, these Ironshod Arbalists continuing to try and shoot as much as they can to try and thin the ranks of these two armies, but the Roqueni, not the best charge, to be honest with you. They hit more, I think, the routing wretches there. Rise of the Pass, out of ammunition now, but getting a decent charge in. Horse Archers, never going to have the biggest charges, but the mass is still going to do a decent amount of work there. The Lancers now able to get around. I think as well that in the end, the Lancers, while they were forced back initially, I think they were able to lay down some effectiveness there against the Troll Guard in the end. J-Monster continuing to try and salvage some kind of situation here, but I think it's all over for him. Having to deal with two armies is rough, especially when you're dealing with the kind of quality that both of these factions can seemingly bring to the field. Defenders of Aglon moving forward as well. But Titus still has an army left alive. He still has a pretty decent army as well. He still has some monstrous units. He still has a Mangonel as well. I saw it trundling in the distance there, which is amazing when you think about it. You know, there's no way that the Mangonels should have survived the encounters with Richie's cavalry, but in the end I guess they did manage to sort of worm themselves away and hide. And Richie just sort of lost track of them, but as soon as that the Feanor forces managed to make their way around through the village and into the back of J-Monster's line, that was the end. And very, very quickly then, both of the armies for the good team managed to roll through this Orc army without too many issues. So positioning was key. And I think J-Monster honestly positioned himself quite well. The Bulldogs are still fighting here, but they're utterly overwhelmed. He positioned himself quite well, like I said. He sort of made as much of a choke point as he could, making use of the bumpy terrain, you know, making sure that the lake was sort of, the lake and the farmstead were reasonably on both of his flanks, to the point where he could not worry as much about the cavalry as Titus ended up needing to. But in the end, he still ultimately ended up getting outflanked. And there was very little he could have done to stop that. There goes J-Monster's general, getting shivved in the back by one of those elven archers. Riders of the Pass here. To be fair, J-Monster still has a couple of units. He's managed to save some halberdiers, perhaps critically as well. He's managed to save some arbalests. If they can continue to get some bolts into the ranks of the elves and men as they move forward, maybe not all is lost. Wretches of Angband routing off the field though, and I don't think they'll be coming back. They're trying to go after the Iron Shod arbalests here. Managed to get some sort of hold on them, but the Iron Shod halberdiers blocking that. So J-Monster knows what's more important for him to save here. He needs to get those bolts back into a nice defensive position alongside his ally here. He has managed to save some halberdiers as well, but managed to get those Lancers of Dweilwen off his back. They're going to chase off the Wretches of Angband. So here, the final phases of this particular battle, the Orcs. Okay, so what began with such promise has sort of descended into a crashing-induced nightmare, as the game has crashed in exactly the same spot the last 3 times I've tried it. So unfortunately, we are not going to be able to see that fight from any sort of reasonable distance. I'm going to have to zoom out way over here in order to try and make it work. And if this doesn't work, then I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do this fight at all, because I'm kind of running out of options here. I really don't know what I'm supposed to do in this sort of situation. It is what it is, I suppose. I've just sort of got a defeated resignation to my tone at this point, but at least the Iron Shot halberdiers shouldn't last for too long in terms of melee, and then hopefully once we really start to get down to business, just the last few units, hopefully then we can zoom in. But I'm not even sure that I want to take the risk of even doing that. But we can see from afar, at the very least, that the Iron Shods are actually holding on reasonably for the time being, but I can't imagine that's going to last for too long. I think the quality of the Forces of Good is going to be far too much at this point, and also they have a significant cavalry advantage. They're going to be able to run right around the back over here, get into the back lines, and presumably they're going to go after stuff like the Mangonel and the Arbalest to make sure that the last hope, really, of the realm of Angband starts to evaporate pretty quickly. Hunters of Rathloriel also moving in, Randirim moving in, the Spear Host? Yeah, the Spear Host of Rathloriel also coming in. You can see there the Lancers of Dweilwen managing to get into the Iron Shot Arbalest, so the last vestiges of J-Monster's army also going to be sent packing. The Lesser Balrog also in here against the Ents and what's left of the archers from the Elves of Assyriand. You can see here also Scouts of Gellion. Just too many numbers at this point from the Forces of Good, able to overload the side, and when part of that is made up of cavalry as well, and you're going to have to take some big hefty charges from those high mass cavalry units, you know that you're in trouble. We also have, however, the Uroloki, who are over here. There's only 9 of them remaining though, so they're starting to take losses, and also you can see that after a big charge, I think several of them falling by the wayside at this point now. In fact, there's only 6 left after that charge. There goes is that the Orc General, or was that the Elven General there? Iron Shot Halberdiers. It's hard to tell at this distance, but again, I have a real reluctance to zoom in after being subjected to a crash at this exact point 3 times previously. Let's go right around from the outer edge just to see if we can't... It jumped a little bit there, which I was a little bit worried about. There you can see the Roroqueni getting in there. The Spear Guard of the Iron Crown completely destroyed, and they're going to get shut down as well. A lot of fighting, a lot of breaking, a lot of fighting to the death. The Iron Shod units without any sort of leadership core are going to be in real trouble here. The Uroloki. Okay, let's try and go forwards. If you see another jump cut here, it means it crashed. Nope. There's still 6 Uroloki apparently. They're sort of just running around in this section of line here. I really want the thumbnail to include one of the Uroloki, and I think this would be the best section of the battle to do it in. It's just a shame that the crashing was so significant. I don't know what was causing it there, but it was bang on the same point, sort of between the 11 and 12k frame mark each time, and I really don't know what it was, because I can't imagine there's anything too taxing here, which is the frustrating thing. And I do have the 4GB patch. I've got all of the fixes. And this is only the sort of problem which is probably only going to affect me because of how far I juice the graphics with my shaders. But it's certainly not the developer's fault. It's certainly just the fact that I'm causing Medieval 2 to melt down with how much I'm asking it to do. But it's never been a problem in the past. So, you know, Guardians of the Iron Crown getting charged down here by the Riders of the Past. I really can't imagine what's left for the Orcs at this point, as the elves of Assyrian continue to move forward in formation, obviously much more lightly armoured than their cousins from the House of Feanor, and also the Ents continuing to run down these iron-shod halberds here. The battle is most certainly over at this point. The forces of men and elves have managed to scour the Orcs of Angband from the land, and the settlement will once again be able to sleep soundly. Lances of Dweilwyn back here. Looks like, yeah, there is another Orc unit over here. Another Spear Guard of the Iron Crown getting into the Ballista Crew of Secretariat, hoping to kill off just a few more elves to make this foray into this foreign land worth it for the Orcs. But I can't imagine they're going to last for too much longer. Even heavy spearmen as they are, they're going to get charged from all angles, I think, here from the cavalry. The Lances of Dweilwyn, as the battle has gone on, obviously more lightly armoured again than their cousins from the House of Feanor, so it's maybe not too surprising that they've taken a little bit more attrition over the course of this long battle. Let's see here. And you can see there the elves have they ran through the defence really, crushing what was left, and the mangonel and the arbalests were really the only hope for the Orcs, and they got shut down pretty quickly by the superior numbers at this point of the elven and human armies. Riders of the Past charging in, but they're going to be made to pay for that from the Spear Guard. The Ents are still in here though, and they're going to start cleaning up the Ballista Crew as well, because they are elven line infantry by nature. They are going to be able to hold their own in this fight when they're backed up by the Ents. I wonder how many kills the Ents got throughout this entire battle, because honestly they're still standing pretty tall, especially after being involved with the Balrogs of J-Monster's army earlier on. Maybe a Balrog would be a more suitable thumbnail than an Urloki. I don't know, I'll make up my mind. Large army there in the background, just reorganising itself. A pretty close fight, all things considered, though. For a while there, it looked as though the Orcs were going to be able to weather the storm over on this side and come in with their superior numbers to win the fight. But in the end, Titus wasn't able to reinforce J-Monster quickly enough, as he was being overrun by two armies. And from there on out, the elves never surrendered the momentum. And there goes. So it must have been the elven general that died earlier on, because that's Titus's general getting run down by the Knights of the House of Feanor. And that is going to be that. So in spite of the, at this point, the rather wearisome crashing issues, which is not just limited to Silmarillion, so it's certainly not an issue with Silmarillion itself. It is just something which has been an ongoing problem for me for quite a while at this point, and I'm not really sure what to do about it. Still, a very good battle to see, and you know, as a first battle, it says clear defeat, but I think that's being a little bit harsh on the Orcs of Angband, to be honest with you. They did pretty well considering the situation they were in. It was always going to be fairly difficult. 3,000 men apiece, but they were still outnumbered by a whole army, so it was always going to be quite difficult for them. But let's see what did the damage for both of the Angband armies. So the Urloki doing very well actually for themselves, so that breath managing to roast quite a lot of the more lightly armoured Sylvan elves, and then obviously in melee kind of juggernauts as well. Guardians of the Iron Crown doing quite well for themselves, 201. Ironshod Halberdiers as well. I imagine that was when they were facing front on against the forces from the House of Feanor, but eventually, of course, that line was wrapped up by a flanking force and their effectiveness was taken away. Ironshod Ravagers doing okay, as was the Orc Mangonel. As for Titus, the Bulldogs doing very well for him, and the Urloki once again, so the Urloki doing well both times. The Orc Mangonels, however, a real disappointment. I think that was a big difference here. Titus's army, he brought two Mangonels, and neither one of them really did anything, which is a big investment to bring to the field if they're not going to do much. But, you know, the Bulldogs did very well against the infantry force that Richie brought against him in the House of Feanor. Few units getting 100, two Ironshod Ravager units actually getting over 100 as well, some Ironshod Halberdiers. So really, when they started to gain the momentum against Richie over on this side, his infantry was utterly overwhelmed by the numbers, and the Orcs were able to get some decent kills from that. But ultimately, of course, in the end, it didn't matter too much with the momentum that the elves and men were able to achieve over on the other side. So yeah, nice battle. Big thank you to J-Monster for sending this one to me, just the first little taster of Silmarillion Total War. And hopefully the first of many, because hopefully we'll get to see as this mod develops, we'll see more things added into it, of course, sort of more units, more factions, but this is an ideal starting point, I think. Very nice looking units. It's clear that a lot of work has gone into this, a lot of work and effort, and I can't wait to see where people's creativity takes them with Silmarillion, because obviously Reforged has been a very good outlet for that up to now. And hopefully Silmarillion can be exactly the same sort of thing, but a very good start, I would say. Very good looking indeed. As I said, I'm not sure whether this will actually be the first Silmarillion replay show. It probably will, just based on timing, but not long after this one. Hopefully there will be some more to be seen of Silmarillion from myself, and hopefully from a couple of others as well, because it really does deserve it. It's clear to see the effort that's gone in to a lot of this stuff, and it's good to see. It's good to see a little bit of variety as well, because hopefully people, every time I've tried to branch out and do something other than Third Age Reforged in the past, it's not been really met with a great deal of enthusiasm. But I think this will be a little bit different, because it's not hugely different from Third Age Reforged, but it's different enough, I think, to the point where it should breathe a little bit of fresh life into my content, which I do think is kind of necessary, because just doing nothing but Third Age Reforged, while it does have a lot of legs in it, there's a lot of sort of new stuff that people constantly add to it. I do feel as though some variety is needed to keep my channel going, and also to keep the modding community for Third Age in general going. I think a bit of fresh blood into things, I think, to give a bit more company to Divide and Conquer and to Reforged can only be seen, I think, as a good thing, especially seeing as people are obviously the Silmarillion is an important thing in many people's hearts when they talk about Tolkien stuff. I don't know a great deal about it myself, but maybe it's time to educate myself on that now that it's becoming a little bit more relevant for me. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this first look from myself at Silmarillion. I know a couple of people have already shown it. I know that J Monster himself has already shown one such battle. I think Scouts of Entertainment has also done one. But yeah, it's just a sign that Silmarillion is finally ready to see the light of day outside of the developers' hands, which I think is a very promising thing indeed. It's good to have something to look forward to over the holiday period, eh? But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next, which hopefully will be more Silmarillion content.